Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mathews. It's wonderful to have you here today and be able to ask you a few questions on this
My pleasure.
125th anniversary of the National Civic League. So my first question is, you've been a university president and a federal cabinet member, and then you went to a research organization.
Right.
So what made you decide to take the job of being a president of such a distinguished research organization, and then what's made you stay for almost 4 decades?
Well, I started with the Kettering Foundation, it seems to me, in the early 70s. So I'm the oldest living trustee.
Wow.
And what intrigued me was that they were all inventors. When they would show their names and the usual stuff after, there were no degrees on there. There were patent numbers.
Wow.
And this was an intriguing group of people. This tradition of innovation and experimentation. And there were folks on there, like George Gallup, for example, who were beginning to move the organization away from just physical chemistry. As you can imagine, a lot of these people had technical, scientific backgrounds, to political chemistry. And in political chemistry, the public. And that was what I was interested in. So it was a fit, and it has always been a fit. And I'm grateful for the opportunities that they've given me to indulge my delusions.
Fantastic. And what's been one of your favorite, I know just like children you can't really say what's your favorite, but I'll ask you anyway, what's one of your favorite things about your job? And that's,
well,
again,
my favorite thing is that they're all the same thing. That is, there's only one thing we study, democracy.
Right.
And it has many dimensions and dimensions, and we can be talking about Bangladesh or Birmingham, but it's the same problem. People trying to get some control of their lives, so the variety is not diversion. It doesn't put. So we study citizens, how they make decisions. We study communities, how they come together or don't come together. And we study the relationship between citizens and communities and institutions as those institutions try to engage citizens and communities, and citizens and communities try to engage them. So it's just 3 things, and it doesn't make any difference where we are. We only study the United States, and we never study about people. We don't do studies on people. We do studies with people. So all of our work is collaborative, and that's, for me, that's very inspiring and energizing. Great,
great. Well, the National Civic League has obviously benefited from that expertise and that interest of yours, and so. What are some of the things that you think are relevant right now for the National Civic League, given its 125-year history?
Yeah, well, this is a very different political environment than 125 years ago. In many ways, today, there are reactions to the things that started in the progressive era. We were very much taken with professionals, scientific expertise. These people were going to lead us to new heights. But Roosevelt was followed by, Teddy Roosevelt was followed by Woodrow Wilson, a couple of presidencies down. And Wilson started off as a political scientist. In fact, he was one of the first scholars of public administration, and he realized that there was a tension between what they were doing, which was to try to professionalize the whole field of public administration, draw on science and democracy. Professionalism says, we know best for you.
Right.
Democracy says, you know best.
Right.
Not necessarily because you have all the answers, but because it's your future that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a tension.
Mm-hmm.
And the tension now is palpable in the loss of public confidence in authoritative institutions,
Right.
including governments.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is the connection.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's the challenge.
Right.
What's the Civic Leadership League going to do
Mm-hmm.
about this loss of confidence, which is compounded by political polarization and a high level of divisiveness?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as I said in the remarks today,
Right.
we know more about what we're angry about than we
Mhm.
do what we are for.
What we're for.
We know more
Yes.
about what we're against than what we're for.
So I'm going to ask you to try to answer that question that you're raising for the National,
Yeah.
or at least give us a little advice, because as you, I mean, I was going to ask you about this anyway, and then you spoke about it, right? So institutional efforts to promote engagement have not increased public confidence in institutions,
No.
right? So, and I wrote down this quote that you said, "If I empower you, who really has the power?" I love that quote, right? So, if people need to make things, and they make them. Citizens, residents need to make things.
The problem that I've been concentrating on in this new book that I hope we'll finish in this millennium suggests that maybe we ought to try a little bit more with our institutions. And that puts a responsibility on citizens that they have to produce things. You can't have a partnership with somebody if you don't bring something to the table.
Right.
And the pushback we're running into, well, you know, citizens are kind of apathetic and really they don't know much of what's going on. Actually, it's kind of troublesome to deal with them. Just let me do it.
Right, right.
Well, the notion that not only can citizens do things, but that there's some things that citizens do together that institutions and their best professionals can't do. That's a hard sell. Even though the Nobel Prize a few years went to Eleanor Ostrom for demonstrating that that was the case, that our large institutions can't really do their job effectively without citizens doing the things that they can only do.
Right, right.
So that's where our research is going.
Okay. And so the National Civic League, though, tries to help institutions do a better job of engaging citizens or residents, knowing that if institutions don't do any civic engagement, then there's little accountability. People say, oh, you've made this decision without us, you haven't engaged us. And then your research is saying, but we don't want institutions to do it for the residents.
Well,
so how
some
do you
things they
balance
have
that?
to do for, but here's what we've found is that the whole engagement, participation, accountability movement boiled down to largely quantitative measures. See these numbers, that proves we're doing a good job. And if you just knew what we were doing, you would love us. It's not what people were looking for.
Right.
People were looking for a different relationship between these institutions. Okay.
Okay.
In other words, accountability is relational. It's not just informational. And I think that's one of the reasons that, although intended with all good purposes, it was off-putting to a lot of people because the relationship didn't take these numbers to Aspen, go home. If you feel better, come back.
Right. So it's all about those relationships and that kind of co-constructing.
Yeah, those there's some illustrations of that happening. I'm just reading one. It's a city manager, it was a Canadian example. And there were salmon fishing going. That was, in fact, the livelihood of the little community. And had a dam so that the salmon would stay in the area. But somebody had cut the dam, and the salmon were going on upstream and being poached. So the fishermen came to the mayor and said, "You've got to do something about this." And he said, "Well, why don't you all come to the mayor's office tonight? We'll open up. We'll talk about what we're going to do." And he went, but he didn't say anything. They talked about it, and then they came up with a plan. And then he said, "Is there anything the city can do to help you?" Okay? That's with citizens taking initiative, doing what they can do, and then go. So we need more examples of that, which respect people, make use of their abilities. There are some things people can't do by themselves, of course. It doesn't mean that professional expertise and professional assistance is irrelevant. That would be silly. But you need to start within before you go out for help.
Fantastic, thank
Or
you.
I'll give you another line. I got it from a community organizer. He said, "Build on what grows." Build on what grows. I mean, the whole thesis of organizing is that there's some deficit out there. You don't have something, you're needy, well, of course you've got needs, but you've also got skills and so build on those. There is no place where nothing is happening.
I love that. Build on what grows. And I did want to ask you about your garden, but maybe at the end,
Yes,
because
right.
I saw that you're an avid gardener. Speaking of growing, so I was raised as a child of the South, and I know I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh yeah.
And I know you were as well.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if you see regional differences in how some of this kind of co-constructing or civic engagement, sort of the interplay between citizens and their government. If you see regional differences that you find interesting or noteworthy.
The principal difference is that when people are talking about what they are doing in the South, they talk slower.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. And they say, "Bless your heart," when
That's
they see
right,
you not
yeah.
doing it right.
Yeah.
So I do want to ask you about your new book, Project with the People.
Yeah,
Which I would love you to autograph a copy for me. And I love talking about people's use of prepositions and
Yeah.
using the right prepositions. So I am curious about why the with. I know you did say if we have so much against, maybe we need more with. But why not for the people or
you
by
should.
the people?
Yeah. Well,
or so why
that's
with the
great.
people?
Yeah, we
Just
should.
curious.
In fact, we take this as an addition, not a replacement for Lincoln's of by and for. Of course we should. Those are great ideals, but we're falling short of the ideals. Government of the people today, you'd be hard pressed to get a lot of yays on that. Government by the people, are you kidding me? Government for, yes, sometimes depending on who it is, and that's great. I mean, that's what governments do. That was, we were talking about Teddy Roosevelt in 125 years. That's one of the beginning points of a assertive government doing things for people. Great. But it has to be mixed with government doing people for themselves and with government, or it overwhelms governments. Governments and major institutions simply cannot do everything they need to do by themselves. None of them are self-sufficient.
Right. Okay. Well, I love that preposition. It's a great one. Is there anything anything else you'd like to talk about a little bit about the book?
Well, the book is still in progress. We're covering a lot of cases. People have a habit of talking about what the government ought to do, and they don't know how the government works. So we're going in depth into fields like school integration, health care, social service delivery, even economic development, and looking at what people can add, what the barriers are, what prevents it, what makes it possible. Well, that takes up a lot of pages. So we're issuing the book in small segments. What you've got now is the introductory part, and so we think if we cut it up into small bites, it will be easier to chew.
I like that. Well, I'm excited to read that introductory as well. So a lot of people are talking about the crisis of democracy, and you talked about the divisiveness. That's a part of that crisis, I think. How would you describe our time now compared to when you were Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare? What are some of the similarities you see? What are the differences? Just give us, since we're talking about 125 years of historical context.
Yeah, usually we divide along partisan lines. We've done that before, and that can get really ugly. And we differ on issues. But there's something going on now that's different. And frankly, I don't know what it is, but it's different. It's more than an issue like Vietnam. It's more than Democrats versus Republicans or liberals versus. And actually, we're doing a study now with some others. Americans agree on many of the issues, but they're not aware of it. And the impression you get is that the country is in turmoil, falling upon itself, and it's not true. There's a lot of agreement. So something else is happening. I've been reading the literature in political psychology. Nobody really has it's an extreme form of what we've seen happening around the world. I mean, in Azerbaijan, one of the provinces of South Russia, formerly part of the Soviet Union, Muslim, Russian, these people lived side by side, neighbors. And then all of a sudden, the neighbors are killing one another. And it happened in Kosovo, and I mean, there's nothing like that. Well, I wouldn't say nothing, but there's less than that. I hesitate to say that because any of that is great. There's no such thing as less than an atrocity. But you can also understand it by the absence. There's not a lot of talk about forgiveness. There's not a lot of talk about reconciliation. Love your enemies. I mean, the real genius to me of the civil rights movement was that it was not for just one group of people. It was all people living up to what we said we believed in, right?
Right.
And there were there were ministers, and the Christian ethic of, you hate the sin, but you don't hate the sinner. I have a friend who was working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he was white, and his job was to work with whites. Okay, so whereas other civil rights movements in the turn of the century failed because the African American community split, one camp around Booker T. Washington and the other camp around W.E.B. Du Bois, and there was no significant white buy-in. And that was very different from the modern civil rights movement, which didn't begin in 1954. It began much earlier in the South.
Right.
I love paraphrasing a line of a friend of mine who was here. It was 1,000 nameless people and 1,000 nameless acts that gave the black community the understanding that we belong in those schools, we belong in those jobs. And they didn't have to wait till the publicity of 1954 or 1963 to know that.
Right, right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, a wonderful way to wrap up.
Yes.
Thinking about loving and forgiveness.
Yes,
and
right.
bringing those things back.
Very Southern.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And building on what grows.
Building on what
Building
grows.
on what grows.
Yeah.
How is your garden, by the way, this year?
Well, I've had to redo it, and it's an old. I started it about 40 years ago, so the soil, the bottom soil, compacts, gets full of roots. So this year I've had to dig the top layer out and dig the second layer down and put the boards back up, and
Oh, wow.
it's. But I just got the sweet potatoes in, so
Nice.
things are looking better.
Sweet potatoes always make everything better.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
really do.
Yeah,
They do. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Well,
Mathews.
it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful
Rachel.
for this conversation, and I loved hearing your remarks, and I will enjoy reading your new book,
Well,
or
thank
the
you.
excerpt of
Thank
your
you.
new book.
And you speak my language, which is nice.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good.
All right.